The God of the Bible's pronouns are not he, him, aka God is not a man. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. Has to do with biology, the actual words of the Bible, and the metaphors the Bible uses to talk about God. Also, we'll spend some time saying, why does this even matter? It almost feels a little silly to even talk about the biology of it, but it is important because God obviously doesn't have the chromosomes needed to have that sort of default maleness and doesn't have the genitalia that would be required for that. But also, in the modern world, we have a bigger understanding of what gender is. And gender doesn't have to just do with biology. Gender is a layer that happens in our development and in our culture. And that is a really important thing when we talk about God's pronouns and God being a man, because that shifts over time. And it has to do with something that sort of you claim to be. And that claim that you're making is directly related to your culture's definition of what it means to be male, what it means to be female. And that actually leads us into the language. So let's talk about the Hebrew language, the actual words that the Old Testament is written in, because language is really key to talking about gender and pronouns, because obviously pronouns are a feature of language, but also language is just a cultural contract that we have with each other as to what words mean. And that means that the language, the use of language, is directly bound to a given culture. So the given culture that the Bible's words were originally used in was a violently patriarchal culture. Like, it was dangerous to be a woman at that place, at that time, among those people. And that's an important thing to understand, because all of the power, all of the control, all of those things were held in the masculine part of that culture. Which means that when they were going to talk about a God who was powerful, who was going to war, etc., they would be using the masculine pronouns. They would be identifying that God with that gender, because all of the things that were included in that gender and that culture were the same things that they were trying to bind up and describe when they were describing God. So when we look at the Bible and we see a lot of he, him, it shouldn't be surprising to us because of the culture into which it was written. But what would be surprising is if you found places in the Bible that the masculine was not used in reference to God. Because what that would indicate to you is that, well, the gender of God is flexible, and it wasn't even particularly bound in that culture. Even that hyper violently patriarchal culture, it wasn't bound up in that culture. Wouldn't it be interesting if you could find something like that in the Bible, in the original language? Turns out you can. Hey, sad Jesus, let's keep going. So yes, you can find that. One of the places that you find that is in the book of Exodus. There's a story with Moses talking to God in the burning bush. This is where God is asking Moses to take on this role of prophet and leader, where God is going to go and stand up to the government and say, you need to free all of these slaves. Moses asks God to give Moses a name. There's a whole really interesting thing just to that interaction. But God does give Moses a name. The name that God gives him is a verb, because the God of the Bible can be extra sometimes. But that verb, like many of the words in Hebrew, carries a gender. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because in Hebrew, there are three genders, similar to the way that English has three genders. There's the male and the female. And then the third gender in Hebrew is almost kind of like the opposite of what the third gender is in English. In English, we call it the neuter gender. It has no gender. But in Hebrew, it's called the common gender. And that is the direct inverse of the neuter gender. It has all gender in it. It's seen to be saying, no, like it's all of the genders combined is in that gender. So God gives Moses a name. It's a verb, but that verb's gender, it's not male. That verb's gender is also not female. It is common gender. Now, that doesn't mean that God is female or God is something else. It means that it's flexible, that description of gender for God is something that is really tied into that culture. And the culture was trying to express something about God by using those gendered pronouns and words about God. But we don't have to stop there, because it extends beyond the words into the metaphors that are used for God. Yes, there's plenty of masculine metaphors used for God. See earlier in this video. But there are also female metaphors used for God. Like in the book of Proverbs, God is personified as wisdom, and that has all kinds of female imagery associated with God. And you can find other metaphors in the Bible that have female imagery is used for God. But seriously, like in a hyper violently patriarchal culture, you have both words and imagery for God that is not male. And that is very, very important. Now, very important on a lot of levels, but we'll talk about the importance in just a second. But I want to talk about it just in how we approach reading the Bible, but also why it matters when you wake up in the next morning. This is yet another example of making sure that you understand that when you're reading the Bible, you are reading something that was written to a specific culture, in a specific place, in a specific time. And those cultural values, they change over time. And so the goal when we are reading the Bible is not to somehow return to some sort of ancient Near Eastern violently patriarchal culture. No, that's a bad idea. We don't want to just make those cultural values holy. We want to do our best to find out what's the cultural piece of this and understand like what the meaning was in that original culture, so that we can then figure out what is a modern meaning of this. Because the Bible is not divorced from the culture into which it was written. It was very much a part of the culture in which it was written. And we have to be careful when we look at the Bible, and a lot of my videos really harp on this, but that we look at the Bible, that we are not baptizing the culture of the Bible, because that culture was so bad. Also, a bigger thing is about our identity. So in the Bible, it talks about God creating humanity in God's image. But if God is a male, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. The idea behind the image of God is that we should be able to find part of our identity in the person of God. That when we learn about a loving and gracious God, it really is also learning about that we are made to be loving and gracious, right? So letting go of God being a male is an important part of that. Question is then, what pronouns do we use for God? I think my personal preference would be for they, them. I think that is better in our culture. I really wish we had a gender that was more like the Hebrew common gender. We don't have that. But the they, them, at least for Christians who believe in the Trinity, it also helps with God in another way, but we don't have time for that.